Okay, I thought we would take a little bit and review some of the things we've talked about so far this semester. It's kind of midterm. You have about a week off. So I thought it'd be a good time to kind of take stock in all of the things we've talked about this semester thus far and kind of preview some of the things we will talk about for the remainder of the semester. So what I did is I went back over the forums, looked at the discussion questions, picked out a few responses that I thought were particularly good and particularly characteristic of the type of discussions that we've had so far in this class, just to give you kind of a overall picture of what we've been doing so far. So we've only looked at really two texts already, Karen Armstrong's Short History of Myth and John Banville's novel, The Infinities. I'm going to go week by week. I've got my notes here. Woo! So if I don't always look like right up at the camera, sorry, I'm not going to do that. So the first week, what we did is I asked this question: what's the difference between mythos and logos? I'm going to, by the way, apologize in advance if I mispronounce your names, so sorry. But we had several interesting responses. Megan O'Brien talks about how logos is a tangible fact, whereas mythos is simply a story illustrating how one should conduct themselves, which is a really good kind of distinction, right, between mythos and logos. And she gave the example of Batman, saying that Batman teaches people to stand up for themselves and to fight for what's right. And we had sort of a short discussion of other things that Batman could teach us, but she's right on in the sense that superheroes like Batman have kind of taken over this kind of mythic role in contemporary culture. So that was a really good response. Trent Fry, the conversation kind of morphed in several different directions. And Trent Fry had this really interesting response to a question I posed about myths and consumerism that I wanted to share. And I had asked why so many myths show up in consumer products, right? That's another place where you can find myth a lot. And he referenced an earlier post by Katie Rice about Nike. And he added that Nike is the winged goddess of victory, right? And so the fact that Nike is an image on shoes is kind of interesting, right? I mean, it's almost as if on some strange subconscious level we're still worshiping certain gods based on the products that we buy, right? I mean, what do we think when we're buying Nike shoes? Apart from, and I don't even know how popular Nike is anymore. But what's the point of buying a product, right? You think that on the one hand that the product is going to give you some kind of attribute that you didn't have before, right? And with Nike, what does it give you? It gives you victory, right? And so this is sort of an interesting example that Trent brought up of how myths sort of resound in contemporary consumer culture. So we went from there on to week 2, and we talked a little bit about Karen Armstrong's Charter for Compassion. I had you watch that really interesting TED Talk where she talks about the importance of compassion and the importance of kind of designing a mythology that takes compassion seriously, right? And so I asked this question: how is it possible to create a compassionate mythology? And Dave McBride, I apologize again. That's totally my fault for being dumb. He's saying that compassionate mythology already is happening through various different cartoons. And so, there are a few people who talked about this in this week. He talks about Martha the Talking Dog, Cinderella, Curious George. Trent Fry kind of responded by talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender, and how the emphasis in the cartoon, right, can foreground kind of a growing ecological sense, which I think was really interesting. I've never seen the show or the movie, so I have no idea. But it is interesting to see those types of shows kind of pop up, right? So on to week 3. This is our first discussion week of John Banville's Infinities. I mean, one thing that I was kind of a little well, it started out I was a little discouraged to see that not many people were referencing the book as much as I wanted them to. So in the future, what I'd like for you to do is to focus primarily on the book when we have questions. Give me more references in the book. Give me the sense that you're actually reading the book and that you want to talk about the book. And I know that was kind of difficult with the Infinities because it was a difficult book. But I had you do an exercise, right, where students were supposed to pick out a deity from Banville's novel and show how it contributes to what Banville called the mystery of life. We watched a video about that. Or to the difficulty of death. The most picked deity, of course, was Hermes, right, because he was the narrator of the novel. But Joe Guffey picked Zeus, talks about Zeus's desire to feel like human beings, to die and to love, which I thought was really interesting. Katie Rice talked about the god Pan, the way that Pan shows us that even in death there is humor, and had a really interesting post about that. This was also the first week in which we did student questions. Shannon Hatchman was the first to do it, and it was a really good discussion questions. So for those of you who haven't done your discussion questions before, I would suggest that you look at hers as kind of a guide of what to do. She was struck by the variety of ways the novel alludes to the possibility of parallel worlds, which is sort of a really interesting theme in the novel. And she asked that what are the strengths and limitations of modern myths? Are they able to, as Armstrong says, help people find their place in the world and point to what is timeless in human existence? Joshua Fraser actually had a really interesting post where he talks about the film Braveheart, and he says that these films really move him, right? He thinks about these films and they sort of stay in the back of his head. But he said that the same thing. There's sort of a limitation in the sense that it seems like myth has a sort of less centralized place in our culture. I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I think it has a more unconscious place, perhaps, in our culture. But it was interesting nonetheless. So that brings us up to this past week. I had you do a podcast exercise, which had an interview with John Banville in which he discussed the Infinities, and I asked you to pick one of the quotes and tell me how this quote connects to the novel. And Corinne McEwen had a really interesting post in which she quoted Banville, where he says that everything we do is in defiance of death. And she says that there's a similar argument in Karen Armstrong's book, but that she found Armstrong's discussion of mythology more contemporary, especially in her call for compassionate mythology, which was definitely interesting. There were 2 discussion questions this week. The first, in which he had this really great discussion question about the figure of the trickster, especially as it relates to the characters Hermes